नमो ब्रह्मादिभ्यो ब्रह्मविद्या संप्रदायकर्तृभ्यो वंशऋषिभ्यो महद्भ्यो नमो गुरुभ्यः। सर्वोपप्लवरहितः प्रज्ञानघनः प्रत्यगर्थो ब्रह्मैवाहमस्मि ब्रह्मैवाहमस्मि। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। ॐ पूर्णमदः पूर्णमिदं पूर्णात् पूर्णमुदच्यते पूर्णस्य पूर्णमादाय पूर्णमेवावशिष्यते। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। ॐ ईशावास्यमिदं सर्वं यत्किञ्च जगत्यां जगत् तेन त्यक्तेन भुञ्जीथा मा गृधः कस्य स्विद्धनं कुर्वन्नेवेह कर्माणि जिजीविषेच्छतगुंसमाः। एवं त्वयिनान्यथेतोऽस्ति न कर्म लिप्यते नरे। असुर्या नाम ते लोका अन्धेन तमसा वृताः तांस्ते प्रेत्याभिगच्छन्ति ये के चात्महनो जनाः। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः। So Ishavasya Upanishad a teaching about one's own self, about the essential nature of the self. That is what Upanishad means. The wisdom, the experience that a person acquires when he sits close to himself. Upa, close, nishat, to sit down. So every Upanishad, the part, although every part of the Veda is about the self, that is one of the declarations of the Upanishads, Sarve Vedaha Yatpadamamananti, the entity which is described in every mantra, in every verse, in every sentence of the Veda. Yet Some of the sentences present it directly, explicitly, and many of them talk about it implicitly, indirectly, in allegorical language which needs to be decoded. One needs to get the keys for these allegorical terms, which, if you translate these words, they mean something very different. But when you understand what they are about, they refer to something. That is how one works with consciousness, because everything that we use, every word that we use actually in any language about consciousness, it's allegorical in nature. When I say, my thoughts are clear, or there is no depth in your thinking, these are allegorical application of depth. You can have depth in water, but how can you have depth in your thoughts? Yet, we understand what we mean. Mostly everybody does. So when it comes, because language is not devised to talk about the entity from which language originates. Language is devised to talk about entities that are out there. And then when we start using that tool to talk about what lies within here, within the experiencer, within the experience itself, then the only way to work with it successfully is to use allegorical language. So that is what we find in many parts, in a big number of the Vedic mantras, which makes it sometimes very difficult, that parable-like expression. But when it comes to the Upanishads, which are really the quintessential teachings, which were considered as the very presenting the key to unlock these allegories, the Upanishads were very clear. The words that have been used, the expressions, the teachings about the self are very clear. Ishavasya Upanishad is the same like every Upanishad. It talks about the self. What makes this Upanishad special, one of the reasons, is that it is most probably the most ancient one. Amongst all the 10 classical original Upanishads, this one is the most ancient one. When, most probably for the first time, the masters decided to express the quintessential teachings in very clear terms. So, in my last discussion, I talked about the various meanings of the word Atman, which is translated into English as the self, the entity which is continuously present, because At means to be present continuously, so Atman is the entity which is continuously present. It is the entity which envelops everything, which is omnipresent. Another root, if you derive the word from the root ap, which means to be omnipresent, then the word Atman means the omnipresent entity. If it is derived from another root, it means that into which everything merges. And the place of merging is always the same from which the entity originates. The place of origin and the place of merging is always the same. Every drop of water originates from the oceans, and wherever it falls, whatever journey it takes, its final destination is always the ocean. So Atman also means the final destination, the final resting place, the final place into which everything merges. That is also what the word Atman stands for. And it also means the entity which experiences everything. That is also one of the meanings of the... Now I'm talking about the literal, grammatical meanings of the word Atman. The entity that experiences the objective reality as the subject to all these experiences. That is also what the word Atman means. Durgacharya, he was a 9th century great grammarian. There are, in Sanskrit language, there are two types of grammarians, because Sanskrit has two forms. One is the extremely ancient Vedic form, which we are studying here now in the form of the Ishavasya Upanishad, or the Vedas are written in that form. And then there is this classical Sanskrit, which came into existence by the efforts of some great grammarians, specifically 3 of them. Panini, the first one, a very well-known name, one of the greatest names in Sanskrit grammar, approximately 4th or 5th century BC. Then the second one is Vararuchi Katyayana, and the third one is Patanjali, who is also the master of the Yoga Sutras. These 3, the work of these 3 produced what is known as the classical Sanskrit, and the Sanskrit before that is known as the Vedic Sanskrit. So the figure, the person that I'm talking about is one of the great grammarians of the Vedic Sanskrit, of the ancient Sanskrit, and he points out one beautiful thing, one beautiful idea, that it is only after the masters devised philosophical systems, philosophical, analytical understanding of the inner experience, that they came up with all these words, Ishvara, Purusha, Prakriti, all these words that we hear in, for example, in yoga philosophy, Ishvara, God, Prakriti, nature, Purusha, the indwelling spirit. All these terms, they came up only after an analytical philosophical approach started taking place towards the inner experience. Before that, the only word that was used was bhava, and bhava means presence, just presence. Or such as we find, for example, in the most ancient teachings, ekam sat, there is one presence. But vipraha bahudha vadanti, wise express it in various ways. So just the word that they used was just presence, that's all. Because that is what a person directly can relate with from his own experience, the experience of a presence, inner presence. So that is ultimately what the word Atman also signifies, yachasya santato bhavaha, that continuous presence. That is what the word Atman stands for. So the final purpose of all these Upanishadic teachings is to tell us about that inner reality, that inner entity experienced by these masters, so that it might inspire us also to follow the path of righteousness, to experience it in our life, and help us to become aware of it in our own life. That is the whole idea of yoga. Yoga, union. Union of what? The realization of the unity, the oneness of the individual consciousness with the universal, omnipresent consciousness. So with this idea in the back of our mind, let us proceed to the next mantra, the fourth one. We'll pronounce it first and then we will try to understand it. As I had pointed out also in my previous discussion, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, these 5 mantras are really the core of Ishavasya Upanishad, which are about nothing else but the self. The other mantras are more like preparation, talking about reducing greed, practicing cultivation, working hard for inner purification, and then why it is important to experience the self as an individual. Why is it important? So that was more like a preface. But what is about to come now, that is really the deepest teaching within the Upanishad, the core of the Upanishad itself. So let us pronounce it. Anejat, 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 ekam, 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 manasu, 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 javiyo, 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 nainat, 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 deva, 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 apnuvan, 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 purvam, 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 arshat, 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 tadhavatu, 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 anyan, 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 atyeti, 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 tishthat, 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 tasmin, 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 apu, 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 matarishva, 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 dadhati, 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 anejadekam manaso javiyo naina deva apnuvan purvamarshat tadhavatonya tishthat tasminnapo matarishva dadhati. Anejat, the first word, it means unmoving. Ajat means that which moves, that which fluctuates, that which trembles, that is called Ajat. And a denial of that is Anejat. As we know, everything in this world is continuously and constantly moving, fluctuating. Everything that seems still and stable. It is only on this level of our experience, on the level of the experience that we have through our senses, it seems stable. But in reality, if we will look at the wider picture, then every atom within these walls that seem so stable are actually, there is tremendous movement going on. This earth in itself is rotating the sun. It seems so still and stable, yet it is constantly moving. And similarly, everything in this universe is constantly moving. Movement is it seems to be the very foundation of everything that is going on, of this ever-changing reality. But consciousness, which is the very foundation of all this movement, which is seen as the very foundation of this movement, the river constantly flows, the water constantly flows, but it needs the riverbed. It needs the riverbed on which it can flow. So a person, for example, a boat that is floating above the surface of the water will float downstream along with that water, because the water is constantly moving till it can anchor itself. It can get hold of the riverbed, which is unmoving, which is unchanging, which does not change. So the whole idea of meditation is to go into that center, because the mind is also like everything out there. The mind itself is also constantly like a river. Patanjali, the yogic masters often compare the stream of thought with a river. The word that is used, Chitta Nadi. Chitta Nadi Nama Ubhayato Vahini. The stream of thought, the river of thoughts can flow in both directions. It can flow from in to out, and it can also be made to flow back unto itself, which enables it to enter deeper into itself. And there it founds that ground in which it can anchor itself. That is what gives it stability. That is what gives it stillness. So this is about that entity, Anejat, the unmoving entity, the unmoving entity which underlies all movement, from which all movement originates. Another meaning that is also there is, because how we understand movement, the other meaning that is also there is that which does not lose its essential nature as it transforms into something else. The unchanging reality. Anejat can also mean the unchanging reality. And what we mean by that, see, for example, when milk transforms into curd, it completely loses its original nature and transforms into something very different. Milk is thin, curd is thick, more solid. Milk is sweet, curd is rather sour. So some properties change. It loses some of its properties. But when you put a crystal which is transparent, colorless, when we put it against a surface which is red, and it assumes some coloring from that surface, does really anything change in that crystal? Even though seemingly it does. But the moment you remove it, you take it away from that surface, the crystal is as transparent, as clean as it as it was originally. And even in that moment when it seems to take the coloring of the surface against which it has been held, even in that moment, in reality, it is completely transparent, clean, and devoid of any colors. So, consciousness is like this. Consciousness is when consciousness transforms into, when that oneness, that singularity transforms into multiplicity, into everything that is there. When that one transforms into many, the idea is that it does not lose its essential nature, it does not transform like milk completely transforms into curd and loses its essential nature altogether, but rather it is like that crystal which just seemingly takes upon itself that coloring, but in reality, deep down, it is completely devoid of that coloring. And the idea is that even in this present moment, when that consciousness has assumed the forms of all these multiplicity and my own individuality, which is one factor in that multiplicity, when a person goes deeper, enters deeper within himself or herself, the individual can still experience it as it is in its essential nature. So this is a little bit an idea that some of the just to emphasize some of the ideas of the ancient philosophers in India, for example, Kapila, Maharshi Kapila, and the difference between the Upanishadic understanding and Kapila's Sankhya understanding. In Sankhya, the transformation is complete, like the milk completely transforms into curd. But in the Upanishadic understanding, that transformation is just seemingly there. It is, yet deep down, the reality remains unchanged. And it is present. It's not only that the reality is like that it was before the creation took place. It's not that. That is also, I think, a little bit a difference between religion and mysticism. Because in religion, the idea is that God is present at the beginning of the creation, and after that, creation takes place. But in the mystical understanding, even while creation has taken place, deep down, as a person goes deeper and deeper into the essence of that creation, in that depth, still the same entity is present. It lingers deep down as the very foundation, that absence of everything, whether you call it the absence of everything or whether you call it the pure presence as the foundation of all this multiplicity. You can call it the nothingness, because it is the absence of everything. That is still ever present. It is ever present as the very foundation over which this multiplicity abides. So it is about that sometimes another word also, achyuta, is also used for this. Achyuta means that which is firm, which is fixed, imperishable, permanent, the permanent entity. In Hinduism, we use the word achyuta for God. It's a name of God, it's a name of Vishnu, it's a name of Krishna. Yet, the Buddha also uses the word. And the Buddha, in Buddhist understanding, there is no idea. Because ultimately it is an experience, and Buddha is talking about that experience, and the masters are talking about the same experience. And the context in which the Buddha uses the word is very beautiful. Ahimsaka ye munayaha. The contemplatives who have evolved the principle of non-violence, which really is the core principle of yogic practices, the first yama, and the rest of the yamas and niyamas are just meant to deepen it, to refine it further. And it is easy to say it, but to practice it in practical terms, it is extremely difficult. For that, a person has to work in practical terms to develop that strength. And that is the strength that a person achieves through the discipline that a person develops by practicing asana, by practicing pranayama, that internal strength that a person develops by practicing the various aspects of yoga, which allows the individual to refine the principle of non-violence in its totality. So the same principle is being pointed at by the Buddha in his teaching, ahimsakaha ye munayaha, the contemplatives, munayaha, muni means the silent contemplatives, ahimsakaha, who have practiced the principle of non-violence, ahimsakaha ye munayaha, nityam kayena samvutaha, and have acquired mastery over the perishable aspect of their being. What do we mean by the perishable aspect of our being? The physical body and the psychological mind. And how does a person acquire mastery over it? How does a person acquire control over it? That is what the idea of yoga. Yoga is not about controlling anything else except the nature as it is. When we speak of controlling the nature, it's not controlling the nature out there, but it is controlling the nature within. It is acquiring mastery over one's body and one's mind. So when after a person has acquired control over, because that control enables us to still the body, to stabilize the body, to make the body stable, to make the breath stable, to make the mind stable, so that the unnecessary noise, the unnecessary background noise, which does not allow us to detect this ever-present presence, which is there, but there are so many layers that have accumulated above it. So many layers of movement, and because our senses always only notice movement, our mind always only notices movement. So one has to do something to train the mind to experience that which does not move. So that happens when a person acquires mastery. So that is what he says. That is what the idea of Dhamma in the yogic understanding is also there. Nityam kayena samvutaha, those who have acquired control over their perishable aspect, te yanti achyutam thanam. They are the ones who enter that unwavering state. Te yanti achyutam thanam. He uses the word achyuta. There also, yatthagatva nasochire, the state which transcends all suffering, all depression, all grief. In Buddha's words. So that is what anejat here means. Anejat, the unmoving, the unwavering entity which underlies all movements. And then the next word is ekam. Ekam, one, the one within all beings. Oneness. It is the one that underlies many. Like it is the unmoving entity which underlies all movement. It is the one which underlies the many. Any questions? Any thoughts about this? Do we relate with it? Any thoughts that you would like to share about this? Yes?
I was a bit confused when you were talking about the difference between religion and mysticism and how that relates with the creation. Maybe you could explain as well how that relates
Yes.
Can you give a question, please?
Yes. She asked me about explaining a little bit more about the difference between religion and mysticism. By mysticism, I understand the fundamental experience that lies at the very basis of all world religions that are there. And when I use the word religion, it primarily refers to the theological differences that are there. So when the beautiful thing about the mystical teachings, whether it's the Christian mystics, it is the Sufi Muslim mystics, it is the Upanishadic mystics, they talk about the same thing. And they are very clear about that they are talking about the same thing. Saint Martin, for example, I again and again quote that quotation because it is really so beautiful, that he said that all mystics come from the same country and speak the same language. Because what they are describing are the underlying principles and not the differences. And religion, the theological understanding of religion, is about particular religious systems of symbols. As long as a person is lost in those symbols, we see the differences, but what are being pointed out by those symbols. When we start thinking about those entities, then there is no... The words that are being used are different from each other, but what they point at, that is the same thing. And when I use the word religion, I usually mean that superficial level of religion, and by mysticism, I understand the deeper level of religion. And why I create this difference, because for many religious people, mysticism remains completely out of reach, or has been actively made out of reach by powers who use religion as a method of controlling the society.
It seems like, too, don't mystics emphasize more experience?
Yes.
Doctrine?
Yes, yes. That is again a major difference between mysticism and religion, is that religion primarily evolves on the basis of faith. You just have to have faith. Either you have it or you don't have it. And if you don't have it, then I don't know. But mysticism takes that experiential approach. It takes that experiential approach. And therefore it accommodates, it easily accommodates questioning. It easily accommodates doubts. And inspires us to do something to resolve these doubts, to be active. But the thing is that religion is easy and mysticism is difficult. Why? Because religion is perfect for lazy people. If you want to be lazy, if you don't want to do the thinking, if you just tell me what is out there, that's all, I'll just believe in it. That's easy. Just believe in it because somebody has told you, just believe in it. To do the effort which Christ did, to make the effort which Christ did, to make the effort that the Buddha did, to make the effort that the mystics did, that requires effort. That requires hard work. Not everybody is prepared for that. Yes?
So in a way, could one say that mysticism does not validate dogmas? Like, let's say, hidden truths which you cannot perceive or understand, even experience them, but you just need to believe in order for you to...
So what is the question?
That, in religion, let's say in Christianity, for example, there are certain concepts, ideas, which are named as dogmas.
Yes.
Dogmas,
Yes.
which in our tradition, belief, religion system, let's say,
Yes.
you just need to believe.
You just need to believe.
That's how they are. So
Yeah.
in mysticism, the idea of dogma is not there.
No, 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 no.
So maybe that's just another big difference.
Yes, yes. And that is why I think some of the greatest mystics all around the world have always been persecuted. Whether it is Meister Eckhart, it is Mansur al-Hallaj, the great Sufi mystic, and like these mystics have always been persecuted. Yes. So that difference is there. Mysticism lacks that dogma. Can you explain to me a little bit more what we mean by dogma?
For example,
Yeah.
in Christianity, by saying that God has three forms or manifestations, like Father,
The Trinity.
Son, Spirit,
Yes.
it's very difficult for the mind to grasp that concept. So we just kind of need to believe that. Or some other, let's say, mysteries which you have to just say, this is how they are. You just believe in that very deeply without even questioning. And there is even a saying like, believing or not, whether you believe or whether you don't believe, just believe. But it's bizarre the way it's been translated, because in reality it's different.
It's different.
Whether
Yeah.
you believe or not, continue your research.
Yeah.
That's how it is from experience.
That is how it should be. Yes.
Meaning like whether you believe or whether you don't believe, keep on the route of seeking, of searching.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
how it is. But the translation, the contemporary translation, was changed to whether you don't believe or whether you believe, just believe.
Just believe. Yeah, that blind belief. I mean, a mystic questions everything. That is the beauty of the Buddha's teaching, for example, when he says that don't take my authority, don't take anybody's authority, except only what is completely understandable. Because what is not understandable, even if it is true, it is of no use. For me, it is of no use. So, yes.
Vedas, they do not refer Indian gods like Shiva or any Vishnu or Brahma. And whatever we are in our daily life learning that Krishna told so and so, that doesn't refer Vedas. So where there is a disconnect, where that change took place. And then that third thing comes rituals, which are very recent, I believe. Like in Ramayana also we came across some yajna, Mahabharata also some yajna there. So that is very recent, I feel. In Vedas also we heard that yajnas are performed. So as a Hindu, I do not connect all these three things. Which originates first, second, or how it goes.
Yes. See, the Vedas, as I said, they are about the self. They are about consciousness. The word Shiva is used in the Vedas. Tanme manaha Shiva sankalpamastu. The word Shiva is used. The word Vishnu is used. All these words have been used there, but in all the contexts they refer to the same entity, to the same presence. Shiva simply means the most auspicious entity. Shankara means the peacemaker entity. Vishnu means the omnipresent Vish Pravesha, that which has entered everything. That is Vishnu. So that is what we find in the original Vedas. What later on happened is, if we look at, because Ashtanga Yoga is at the very foundation of everything that came later. So for the sake of dharana, for the sake of focusing the mind on something, to train the mind to focus on something, and the mind which is deeply conditioned with names and forms, and therefore at the very onset, at the very beginning, cannot focus, cannot rest itself, cannot find. I was talking about anchoring ourselves in that ultimate nameless, formless entity. But the mind which has always thought in terms of names and forms, in terms of words and forms, to tell that mind, now you have to focus on that which has no name, which has no form. In practical terms, when we are, it sounds beautiful, but in practical terms, it is extremely difficult. So, for the sake of dharana, which is before dhyana, which is before samadhi, what Patanjali calls desha bandha, you have to bind yourself to an object. An object. And it is easy if that object has a name and has a form and has a name which has a deeper significance and has a form which has deeper significance. So this practice of dharana gave birth to the Agama texts, which are slightly different from the Vedic texts, which then inspired the 7 Agama traditions in India, the 7 worship traditions, we can call them, in India. Vaishnava Agama, the worship traditions of Vishnu; Shaiva Agama, the worship traditions of Shiva; Shakta Agama, the worship traditions of Shakti; Ganapatya Agama, the worship traditions which worship the same formless, nameless supreme divinity as Ganesha, as Ganapati; Saura Agama, the worship traditions which worship the same supreme divinity as Surya, as the sun. These are what is known today as Hinduism, and the other 2 were the Jaina Agama and the Bauddha Agama. The Jaina traditions, the Jaina worship, they have also worship traditions. They have eloquent temples, big temples, Jaina temples all over India. They have statues, they have a complete worship tradition on their own, and the same is true about Buddhism. So these 7 worship traditions came into existence. The purpose of every worship tradition was the same. And therefore there was, even though the worship methods were completely different, the objects were completely different, depending on the tradition you belonged in, the final goal was always the same thing. So that is how today what we understand is Hinduism, what we understand as Hinduism is deeply dependent and related to one of these worship traditions, which had evolved originally as a practice of dharana, as giving us meaningful objects. You could choose any object to train your mind, but at some point it won't have the depth that the image of Vishnu has, for example. He might seem initially strange, a man of blue complexion, with 4 arms, holding these 4 things in his 4 arms. Could there be somebody like this out there? But when a person goes deeper into, first of all, this philosophical understanding, let me say this mystical understanding of the pure presence, and then understands the symbolical significance of what these 4 things that he holds in his arm signify, what the blue complexion that he has, what that signifies. When we understand that and relate that with this, then we go deeper, which any object out of the blue won't be able to do that, won't be able to take us into that depth. So Agama, whether you call it Agama or whether you call it Tantra, they are the same thing. The problem with the word Tantra is divided into the left-handed Tantra and the right-handed Tantra. Usually when we hear the word Tantra, the left-handed Tantra comes into our mind. And this, what I'm talking about, this is the right-handed Tantra, which rather the word Agama is used for that. So that is how these various traditions came into existence, and at the foundation, everywhere lies this. And that is why the Upanishads are the very foundation of all these various worship traditions. I would say even of Buddhism and even of Jainism. Yes, Buddha did not accept the authority of the Vedic teachings that was there, but all the concepts that he's making use of, he's just, what he stood against was giving them blind authority, that's all. But all the concepts, all the ideas, when he talks about asat, about that shunya, about that absence of everything, asadevedamagrasit, it has been mentioned in the Upanishads as well. So it is the very fountainhead of all the ideas. So that is its purpose. But when we look even at the Puranic literature, ultimately when a person goes deeper into dhyana and samadhi, a person has to transcend these names and forms to enter the nameless and the formless. So they are just means that are there. This is the ultimate teaching. So that sort of puts everything into perspective when we work with that. Does that answer the question? Yes. And yes, then you asked about the rituals also. Yes, rituals on an initial level, they prepare the foundation. There is an interesting discussion later on, which will come in one of the mantras here, that those who keep on performing rituals blindly, they remain in darkness, which is to give the individuals a push that a person has to go deeper than those rituals. Yet those who practice meditation without having performed rituals, without having performed karma, because the word in Sanskrit for rituals is karma kanda, as you know. So without having performed these purificatory rituals, purifying rituals, they go even into deeper darkness, worse darkness, because they have not performed the necessary preparation. So a person tries meditating, but the mind just runs here and there. And the preparation which was essential, the hard work, yajna is just one aspect of it. Yajno, danam, tapaha. There are three things. Yajna, dana, charity. Yajna is worship, and when we speak of worship, at least in the Vedic context, we mean worship of light, worship of physical light as a symbol of the light of consciousness. That is what yajna is about. The earthly light is worshipped, is meditated upon. So it's seen as a preparation. Yajna, dana, charity, and tapas, voluntary hardship. The practice of asana and pranayama, all these practices, they are part of it. So yajna, dana, tapa, these three things which are essential for purity, without that, meditation, if you look at the case studies, for example, that psychologists have done with meditation, for many people it was not a good experience, because if the inner cleanliness has not been created, and therefore we have these two divisions in the Vedic teachings, Devayaji, Atmayaji. One is the worshipper of the gods, Devayaji, the worshipper of the gods, and Atmayaji, the one who worships for his own self. Atmayaji is defined as someone, idam me anena sanskriyate, this work, this action may purify me, may help me to get rid of the agitating thoughts, negative thoughts. A person who performs these actions with that understanding, he is called Atmayaji. So rituals are beautiful means to prepare oneself. That is there. So that is the relevance of rituals, but often when we start liking something, when we start enjoying something, we stick with that, and when there are financial gains attached to it, then a person does everything who has not evolved that deeper need. He does everything. So that's what sometimes the priesthood ends up doing with the society, that it wants the society to remain in those rituals and never go beyond it, because they benefit from that. So that understanding has to come. So it is relevant, yet sticking to it altogether and forgetting the deeper essence is what the Vedas, which are about yajna, the same Vedas also at some point when they start speaking about meditation, they use words, harsh words, such as Agni Mugdho Dhumatantaha, Agni Mugdha, deluded by the fire, by the ritual fire, and exhausted by the smoke coming out of it, and hence forgetting oneself altogether. These are the words that have been used. I'm talking about the Brahmana texts. This is from the Taittiriya Brahmana, this mantra. So at some point, this push that now it's enough with rituals, you have to go deeper, you have to explore. This was just a method. It was not that you need to stick with it. And I think sometimes our world, many people in our world require that as well.
So it's with karma yoga the same?
It's with everything.
So there is a time
yes.
that you can do karma yoga,
yes.
you can purify,
yes.
but the time comes you have to go deeper.
You have to go deeper.
And so with Guruji says, purify with asanas.
Yes. Asana is a form of karma yoga. It's karma yoga. It's a form of karma.
But the time also comes when you have to go deeper.
Yes. Otherwise,
perform asanas.
we'll just be performing asanas, and that's all. And at some point, the journey will end. We will think that yes, every asana that we are doing now, it's perfect, and that's it. There will be no deeper growth than that. And a person will just be performing asanas because yes, people like it. You can make a lot of money by teaching it. So in financial terms, it is extremely beneficial. But has it become a means? Has it become a means of going deeper? The problem is with every means that a person takes, whether it is those rituals, whether it is asana, whether it is charity, whatever it is, there is always this pitfall of getting stuck to it. And many times the teachings of the masters, when they speak a little bit against it, this is one of the principles of the Vedic teachings. Nahi ninditum ninda prabhavati. When the masters condemn something, they are not interested in condemning that thing per se. Because why should they condemn something? They condemn it to raise our awareness into something else which is deeper. So if the masters, if the Buddha, for example, condemns ritualism, if the Upanishads condemn ritualism, it's not to condemn ritual per se. They are not interested in that. Buddhists themselves started performing rituals. Which Buddhist does not perform ritual? Which Jain does not perform rituals? Because rituals for the society who still has not evolved to this level, it gives them something tangible. I mean, what is a puja? If you understand what a puja is, we do avahana, the consciousness which is present within me. If you do it with understanding the mantras, avahana is evoking the presence of the consciousness that is within me in the statue or in the picture or in any symbol that is there in front of me. For that time I create a duality, and I welcome. Everything in puja is just what a traditional Indian householder used to do with his esteemed guests. He would give water to clean the feet, arghya, then padya, then arghya, water to wash your hands, wash your face, then give him a bath, and eventually give him some food. That is what a person does in puja. And then finally, visarjana. Visarjana, which means allowing the divinity whose presence has been evoked in that and which has been welcomed and worshipped in that statue, to allow it to enter back into the heart of the meditator. That is visarjana. That is how the masters explain it. The whole ritual is just this. And it is just an external enactment of meditation. If we just sit down and meditate like this, our mind might run away, go here and there, but this gives us engagement. It's an action. It engages us. It engages all our 5 senses. Because we make use of flowers, we make use of perfumes, we make use of all these different things. So it completely engages our senses into that meditative process. But ultimately it's just a yogic exercise. Why otherwise does every ritual start with pranayama? Look at any ritual thing, you will see the first thing is asana. Yes, the first thing is asana. And then the second thing is pranayama, and then the ritual starts. But it is always first asana, then pranayama, then the rest of the ritual. So it's all about dharana, that's all. So initially it is useful. Ultimately then, for a while a person performs these external rituals, then as the consciousness develops, as the capacity of focusing develops, then what are called manasa puja, mental rituals, then there is no need of any external objects. You just perform it internally. The same ritual it already becomes a meditative act. Then slowly and slowly the amount of the actions is reduced. Then the amount of the deity that is being taken in is reduced till everything, a person gets rid of everything. This is how the capacity to meditate was developed. That is how texts like Vishnu Purana, for example, explain it. It's not something that I have concocted it, yes.
So, if, say, you're a person who's going to get on a plane and go back to New York City, where you live, and doesn't really plan on becoming a monk. Thought about it, but not going to. I mean, what for me in the Upanishads is always very beautiful, and I feel like you kind of said, maybe it's just I read a lot of poetry, so maybe it's just my interpretation.
You read a lot of?
Poetry.
Poetry, yes. Yes.
Reading of texts. Is that when you were talking about that these rituals were the way that people would treat a guest who came to their home?
Yes.
Very much when I read these, to me it's like that it's inside you, and this line in particular. So it's always there and it's always unchanging.
Yes.
And then also everyone around you, which is very beautiful to me because I think in other texts that I've read, there's this idea that you are kind of just responsible for yourself.
Yeah.
And that to me makes it very simple, you know. It's not that, I don't know what I'm trying to say. Like what you were just saying started to scare me a little bit, in that I wouldn't ever be able to, you know what I'm saying? And when I read the Upanishads, it's like, oh yeah, it's easy in a way. I don't know. And maybe talking a bit about the light, because I feel like when we talk about these things, we always talk about like that thing that's coming from dogmatic religion where you have to do this and this and this, whereas this is more sensing, I don't know. And I feel like we don't talk about the light side of it and that it's there for us just by being that we have this form, you know, we have this love.
Yeah.
Put me the question.
I don't think it's that
It's
serious. No?
yeah.
I mean, it is serious, but it's also, I mean, am I completely listening? I guess that's my question.
Yeah. I don't think that there was even a question. It is rather more sharing her own experience in relation to that. Yes. Yes. And of course, the challenge of being aware of it in New York, in big cities with so much rush, even the challenge of being aware of it in Rishikesh. That challenge is certainly there, to retain this awareness in our understanding. But yes, the more we think about it, the more we contemplate it, the more we make our mind comfortable with these ideas, and the more comfortable it gets. That is the whole idea of contemplation. The more comfortable the mind gets with these ideas, the more it starts liking it. The more it starts developing a sense of liking what I understand by bhakti, by devotion, which is a very natural development of purification. That when a person gets rid of these agitating thoughts and becomes more and more aware of that peace, of that tranquility, you start liking it. You just can't. Kapota iva garbhadhim. Rigveda uses a beautiful metaphor. Kapota iva garbhadhim. I come back to you again and again, like a dove comes back to its nest, because it is wherever it goes, everywhere it goes, but because its children are there, it keeps on coming back, because it has that love, it has that attachment. So it, from vast distances, it flies back to it. So the same thing sort of happens with this inner entity. The more we become comfortable, the more it starts making sense to us. Every moment, we don't have to contemplate on it. But that's the natural thing. If you are not worried about anything else and you just have a few moments when, for example, you have to wait for the doctor, and then in that moment, naturally, the thoughts are drawn to it. So that, I think, is the most important thing. That is what I understand by bhakti, which then ultimately leads to dhyana, the deep insight. Because where there is love, there is understanding. So then it doesn't matter whether we are in New York or whether we are wherever we are. Part of life is always challenging. It's challenging. Do you think the masters who lived in caves, often people think living in cave would be so peaceful, so nice, so happy. Is it really? It's a big challenge. Everyday challenge. How to find food. I mean, you need to eat something. You cannot just always keep on breathing in air. You have to feed yourself as well. How to do that? How to meet those challenges? To live high up on the Himalayan mountains in those caves, how to do that in snow? Big challenge, big challenges. So challenges are everywhere. That's part of this reality. Yet within these challenges, we have to, whether we become a monk or not, in the Vedic teachings, and this is something that I find very beautiful, the greatest masters, none of them are monks. They were householders. Yajnavalkya's discussion is with his wife, Maitreyi. Uddalaka's discussion is with his son, Shvetaketu. So yes, there was always an acceptance of both paths. Pravritti Marga, the path which goes through the world as a person living in this world, fulfilling his duties, develops this awareness in his life. That is Pravritti Marga, and Nivritti Marga is leaving these duties, going away from it. That's the monastic monastic path. Both paths were equally valid and equally acceptable and equally respected.
So then when light is spoken of?
When light, yes.
Is it that your path, what it is, whatever it is, or where you are living, that you do that with light, with levity, with joy? Do you see what I'm saying?
Do you?
Do that with like joy and
Yes.
light and levity.
Yes.
Do you know is that what it's referring to in these texts in your understanding?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And the understanding, the more, something is very interesting, because consciousness seems to be a different kind of light, or maybe just a different face of light. The interesting thing is that the more we understand light, the more we understand the mind. There is a beautiful book by Arthur Zajonc, who has compared how, with the physical understanding of light, eventually culminating with quantum mechanics, we have actually, at the same time, the more we understood light, the more we understood the mind. Because they are deeply, deeply related. To us, it might seem as something completely different, physical light out there and the light of consciousness within, which is what this difference, and that is what the masters say, this difference between Adhyatma, the inner realities, and Adibhuta, the outer realities, ultimately this difference is not there. It's just, I believe it is the first person experience of light is consciousness, and the experience of light out there in its physical manifestation is what we refer to light. Ultimately, it's one and the same thing. So, contemplation of light gives us deep insights. All these deep insights that we find in the Upanishads are actually the result of contemplating light. If you contemplate the internal aspect of light, you come to the Upanishads. If you contemplate the external physical aspects of light, you come to the theory of relativity. Okay, so let us conclude with the universal prayer for the well-being of all beings. सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत्। ॐ शान्तिः शान्तिः शान्तिः।